Okay, good. So I finished up with this part. So we're in this internal transformations part of the nitrogen cycle. And I talked about mineralization and immobilization last time. I want to talk about nitrification today. So nitrification is essentially what it ends up is being the oxidation of ammonium to nitrate. And it's a really important process, not only because it converts or transforms nitrogen, and provides essentially nitrate, which ends up being the most common form of nitrogen that plants take up, but it's also an acidifying process. Okay, so we're taking, you can kind of see that here, we're taking hydrogen ions in the process of converting those to nitrate, we're producing acidity. So this is part of the issue with nitrogen deposition in ecosystems, is that when you have nitrification, that's producing acidity. Okay, and once you produce acidity, when cations leach out of ecosystems, acidification can enhance leaching of cations out of ecosystems, okay? Because hydrogen ion can replace things like calcium and potassium on exchange sites. Once they move into the soil solution, they're much more susceptible to leaching. And so part of the issue with nitrogen deposition in ecosystems, because nitrification is acidifying, it often leads to leaching of cations and cation depletions from ecosystems. So in the northeastern United States, for example, lots of calcium leaching has led to lots of problems. So red spruce, for example, the species red spruce, calcium is influential in like frost hardening for lots of species. And so when you leach things like calcium out of ecosystems from acidification, it causes lots of problems. It also, there have been big stories about bird eggs and how essentially bird reproduction has been influenced by acidification, and that's because calcium, when you leach calcium out of ecosystems, calcium is the main constituent of bird eggs, and so there's been links between acidification of ecosystems and things like animals, right, birds. And sugar maple is a very calcium-demanding species, and so sugar maple decline has at some level been linked to acidification. That's coming, at least in the northeastern part of this country, is coming because of high rates of nitrogen deposition. Okay, so we're taking ammonium. This is a process that requires oxygen, so it happens in oxic environments. It's 2 steps. So the first product is NO2, and then the second step is a further oxidation of NO2 to NO3. This is actually, these 2 pieces of nitrification are actually done by 2 different genera of bacteria. So the first step, Nitrosomonas, and the second step is Nitrobacter. And these things tend to exist in these, like in a consortium, where they're sort of both existing together and utilizing, the Nitrosomonas utilizing ammonium, Nitrobacter using the NO2 that's produced by Nitrosomonas. Okay? Again, it's a process that's not completely efficient, and this leaky pipe can create NO or N2O gases, so you can lose, it's a transformation, but it can also be a loss pathway for nitrogen depending on the efficiency of those. So N2O gas lost during this reaction essentially, obviously, is taking it back out from reactive forms to atmospheric forms. And so the big issue with this is that it's not just, so nitrogen deposition can have direct effects, so the direct effects of too much nitrogen in ecosystems, and nitrogen saturation, part of this idea of nitrogen saturation, or too much nitrogen in ecosystem can have direct effects of too much nitrogen, but the other one is that some of these indirect effects. So because it's acidifying, you're increasing the potential for leaching of other cations, but you're converting something which is ammonium, which is a cation and is less mobile in soils, to an anion, which is more susceptible to leaching. So most of the nitrate bleeding out of most of the nitrogen that's bleeding out of ecosystems and into fresh waters is nitrate, because the soils just don't have the capacity for rich retaining that, right?
Or
Yeah.
can you expand on like the energy benefit that they get?
So it's just a redox reaction.
Yeah.
So you're taking a reduced molecule in the same way that any other redox reaction is oxidizing reduced molecules. And so you have the potential here, back and go back to our okay, so we have an oxidation state down here, reduced forms, oxidized forms, and so from ammonium we go from -3 to nitrate +5. So that's the big energy benefit of this reaction. So here's a slightly cartoonified version of this. So you have ammonium, nitrification, so you're converting NH4 to NO3, but in the process, this is this leaky pipe concept, right? So there's incomplete, and I don't fully understand the chemistry in which, and the conditions under which you might increase the proportion of N lost here, but, and ultimately, though, this is, in some ecosystems, can be one of the dominant forms or the dominant pathways through which you get production of NO or N2O. Further, so then, and this points to kind of the next step of this and the completion of the nitrogen cycle. Nitrate is the substrate, the electron acceptor for processes in which heterotrophic organisms are using carbon, but they're not in anoxic environments, but they're using nitrate as a terminal electron acceptor instead of oxygen as a terminal electron acceptor. And that, it's in the same way you can get conversion of some of this nitrate to N2O or NO, but the majority of it is moving towards N2. And the proportions of those are really seem to be influenced by the amount of oxygen in the system. So, and that links back to kind of how saturated systems are. So in most aquatic systems, most of this is being denitrified to N2. In soils, you get more production of N2O or NO. Okay, so nitrate is more susceptible to loss because it's a cation. What this does, and because this so much energy is released, most of the nitrogen floating around, at least in soils, ends up as nitrate, which means that plants and other things using it have to reduce it again back to ammonium in order to essentially in their metabolism to create a form of it that's, so NH4 as a reduced form is more like what organisms need the nitrate is. And so this is the nitrate. So the organisms require nitrate reductase and energy to move this back to ammonium in cells. Okay, and this is where you can see here, so this is, ammonification is just another word for mineralization. Okay, so this is the conversion of organic N to ammonium. Nitrous ammonius, there's our hydrogen ions that get released here. Okay, so for every molecule of ammonium that's nitrified, we're generating 4 protons. And that's and if you see in areas that have been impacted by nitrogen deposition, one of the most striking observations is really significant declines in pH. In that paper I sent, the Bowman paper yesterday, looking at decades of sulfur and nitrogen in the case of the Tatra Mountains in Slovakia, but that decades of deposition has caused really sharp declines in pH and big losses of cations out of the system, to the point where plants in that system, because of heavy cation leaching, and when you get acidification of soils too, you make things like aluminum and iron much more soluble. And so plants in heavily impacted systems are actually taking up things like aluminum and iron instead of calcium and magnesium. So in that particular study, we essentially simulated a nitrogen deposition event. by adding nitrogen onto soils and then looking at what happened to the plants. We added in 3 different levels. And when you at the highest level, essentially, or as you increase N inputs into the system, you see really sharp declines in biomass, and the concentrations, the mechanism that seems to lead to lower plant productivity is that they're taking up things like iron and aluminum. And that's all linked back to the fact that when you add something like ammonium into systems, nitrification creates a lot of acidity.
That's after an initial boost in productivity, right?
So yeah, so if you sort of think about most of the ecosystems that we've talked about, right, in the Elser paper that showed that a lot of ecosystems are nitrogen limited. So if you look at the effects of adding nitrogen, you would expect benefits to a point, and then at which point you reach some saturation. We tend to think of it as a saturation point. And then you would see for every increase or further increases in N deposition, you would see declines in productivity. What other things would you expect if you sort of measured ecosystem processes or other things in ecosystem would you expect as you reach a point where nitrogen becomes no longer limiting?
Increase in biodiversity.
Okay, so, and there's been really, I guess, robust links between declines and diversity. We'll talk a little bit more about this next time, but N deposition has been really closely linked with declines in diversity. And largely because N tends to have fertilizing effects on dominant species, and so you get declines in less competitive species. What else? Would you expect more nitrogen in streams under high N deposition, or at the point at which N is still limiting, or at that past that saturation point? Yeah, so you tend to see in streams and you see increases in cations in streams to a point, and in lakes and in the Tatras, for example, it's past the point at which even cations are buffering against changes in freshwater, because once they're in streams and in lakes, they eventually leave too. So you tend to reduce the buffering capacity not only of soils, but also of streams. So they become much more susceptible. Do you know what I mean? Understand what I mean by buffering capacity? So as you add hydrogen ion to soils, that exchange of hydrogen ion onto exchange sites with other base cations would tend to buffer soils against a change in pH. So as you add acidity to well-buffered or systems that have lots of cations in them, you don't see changes in pH. pH can stay pretty constant for a long time until you remove all those cations. And then compounds like aluminum oxides and iron oxides provide the buffering capacity, and that's why you see solubilization of aluminum and iron at low pH. People have also measured big decreases in cations over time. So as you increase N availability in N-limited systems, you increase productivity, but at the point in which you start seeing declines in productivity, you see parallel declines in base cations. So reflecting the fact that cation economy has been severely depleted because of so much hydrogen ion being input in systems. Rates of nitrification tend to go up, right? Typically you wouldn't expect high rates of nitrification in N-limited systems because that nitrate is being scavenged by microbes and fungi and plants. Okay, but as soon as the supply of nitrogen is in excess of the demand, that's when you start seeing all these other factors and other processes starting to kick in. And there's a really great set of papers about that. If people are interested, John Aber at the University of New Hampshire and his group was one of the first groups to really argue or present this idea of nitrogen saturation. And they presented it as a hypothesis, and it's been validated in many, many ecosystems, especially because we have so many ecosystems that are nitrogen rich now. But you're right, the carbon, increases in carbon storage on land, a lot of that increase in carbon storage on land has been linked to the fact that we're fertilizing natural ecosystems. So many are still nitrogen limited, many natural ecosystems. It's really the ones that are in that, I showed you the map of nitrogen deposition with the big red hot spots. Those are the ones where essentially, we're seeing some of these big effects. And we went to the Tatra Mountains in Slovakia because it's right essentially downwind from what was like the former East Germany and, you know, the really, really highly polluting areas in Eastern Europe. There's this feedback, so nitrification is an acidifying process, but as you get into low pH or high pH, those situations tend to suppress nitrification. Okay, so and this is just sort of an empirical relationship, but it tends to be best at sort of highest rates, potential rates of nitrification at neutral pH, and it seems to decline at lower and higher pH values. And that's just, if you look at processes that, if you look at sort of the main controlling factor of microbial communities, pH is the strongest predictor of microbial community composition, really no matter where you look. So there's really strong pH controls on the organisms that are conducting the bacteria that are carrying out this process. So nitrification produces nitrate. This is essentially the leaky or the biggest loss pathway from ecosystems, at least through water, right? So soluble nitrogen. So this nitrate in systems in which where there's still the supply is less than demand, you would expect that most nitrate produced from nitrification would be taken up either by plants or immobilized by microorganisms. And it's really interesting if you go, like even in natural systems, like the ones I work in the tropics, where nitrogen is really cycling in excess of demand, and where nitrogen doesn't tend to be limiting, if you go and measure nitrate concentrations in soils, they're always pretty low. Okay? They're not as low as you might expect if we went out to a grassland in Montana, but they're fairly low. And that's just because nitrogen is in such high demand, and even in areas where it's pretty rich, it gets taken up pretty rapidly. And so you don't see pools built of nitrate building up in soils. In places where you do get nitrate production, that's where you would expect denitrification to kick in, right? So when there's an excess of nitrate, in excess of demand by plants, and seasonally. Remember, this is not just a spatial thing, this has a temporal component. So in times of the year when plants are actively taking up nitrogen, right now, for example, right? If we went out to sites, local sites, we would expect to find higher nitrate concentrations in soils right now because plants are senescing, right? They're all kind of dying back for the winter. There's a big pool of carbon sitting in soils and decomposition is happening, so you're getting nitrogen mineralization. But the nitrogen, like nitrate that's being produced, there isn't a big demand for it right now. So if you go seasonally and measure nitrate concentrations in streams, you would expect a seasonal pattern that reflects production of it, but also that reflects the demand for it. Yeah.
So when snow melts in the spring, is that a huge loss of nitrate, or are plants do they like wake up early enough and are nitrate starved that they?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It depends. So if you're in a system where you get a lot of snow, right? Snow melt happens gradually, and it usually happens, obviously it has to happen before the plants wake up, right? And so in snow-dominated systems, you tend to see a big pulse of nitrate out of those systems early in the spring, okay? That you would expect that to sort of be attenuated when plants start waking up, right? And so then the demand for nitrogen is much higher. Around here, right, in the Missoula Valley, where we don't get tons of snow, most of that, there's probably not enough leaching, or there's not enough volume of water to move that nitrate out of soils, and so you might expect it to build up, but it's not necessarily leaving, and then as soon as the plants wake up, there's a big supply of nitrogen. So that winter-derived nitrogen essentially fuels the next spring's growth. there's been a really interesting set of studies looking at, so one of the things that we might predict with climate change, and we see it around here, is a greater proportion of our precipitation coming as rain versus snow. And one of the really interesting, so people have done like snow removal experiments to look at how this affects biogeochemical cycling in snow. And what you find is that snow insulates soils, and so there's almost always liquid water in soils under snow, right? But if you have like you say, you have a fall snowfall event like we had this year, or then you get an early rain on snow event, and then it gets really cold. Like this weekend might be a good example, right? So it's raining out right now, but then it's gonna get really cold. And what that does, that freezing of soils tends to essentially kill all of these nitrifiers and all these bacteria, and so it creates a big pulse of nitrogen. And so in these snow removal experiments, one of the common observations is to see much more nitrate leaving the system because there's not immobilization under sort of a insulated snowpack. And they've seen this at Niwot Ridge in Colorado in sort of seasons or in years in which there's not an early snowfall to insulate that, but the soils freeze. Those years tend to be accompanied by much bigger losses of nitrogen out of those systems than if you have an early snow that insulates that and then you just build it up on top of that over the year. Then you get more of a sort of a processing under snow. Like this stuff is all happening under snow, right? If you dug down under a snowpack and took a soil sample, you would find all sorts of these processes happening. But if you freeze them, then you kill all those microorganisms, then you see that's when you can tend to see a big pulse of nitrogen loss out of the system. Okay, so nitrate can either be leached, right, taken up by a microbe, reduced via denitrification, taken up by a plant. Here's the leaching piece of this. So there's all sorts of different fates, and the fates of those are important for determining lots of other aspects of the system. In some sites where you have predominantly negatively charged soils, okay, so like in parts of tropical ecosystems, they can nitrate can absorb on anion exchange sites, but this is the exception rather than the rule. And then if you look across the literature, from especially in literature looking at most of the ways in which people have assessed, or a lot of the way people have assessed limitation in ecosystems is to look at what's coming out of streams. And if you look at the tropics, there's way more nitrogen coming out of streams than you would ever see in the temperate zone. Okay, and that's been used to infer that nitrogen is not limiting in tropical ecosystems. The caveat to that is that in really wet systems in the tropics, where you increase loss pathways, right? So you increase the potential of leaching, you increase the potential of denitrification because the soils are more saturated. So there are places in the very wet tropics that show signs of low that look like temperate forests, just because the rate at which nitrogen is produced is essentially balanced by the rate at which it's lost. Okay, so nitrification is an internal transformation, but it does represent a loss pathway because you can get losses of gaseous forms of nitrogen during nitrification. The most important loss pathways would be leaching, especially of nitrate. You can get some leaching of ammonium, but this is much rarer. Okay, most of the time, ammonium, because it is such an energy-rich substrate, gets converted to NO3. This is also a cation, so it has it's much more likely that it's going to be retained in soils. Nitrate is the dominant form of nitrogen loss from ecosystems. But just recognize that even in highly N-rich systems, most of it, at least probably 50% of it, is being denitrified. Okay, and we never really see it because we can't measure changes in N2. So this is done using a mass balance approach as well. So So like on a watershed scale, if you look at inputs of N and you look at losses from streams, the difference is assumed to be denitrification, right? Assuming a steady state. Because the amount that plants are taking up and using is sort of not, the pool size is not changing unless you're in a really rapidly growing or a grading ecosystem. Okay, I talked about this one a little bit. Ammonia volatilization is another pathway. It tends not to be very common in most natural systems because it's predominantly occurring in systems with pHs of around 9 or above. So this is another predominantly agricultural loss pathway. Because animal wastes tend to have high pH. So when you increase, or essentially when you're in feedlots, for example, or manure application onto the fields, you can actually increase the pH enough that you get ammonia volatilization. And I lived in Boulder, Colorado for years, and you could always tell when there was an east wind blowing, because the feedlots in Greeley, you would suddenly get this, you'd walk outside and be like, whoa, right? And that's just volatilization of ammonia that's happening from those animal systems. It can't, and I'm not trying to imply that it never happens in natural systems, but it's quite rare. Okay, what's the sort of most common soil pH range for natural systems? Guesses?
6.
Okay,
Yes.
6 is good around here, 6.5 around here. We actually have quite high pH soils, so 6 is actually quite a high it's neutral, but in the soil's pH realm, it's quite high.
Is that from the carbonate geology?
So partly, it's not even the carbonate geology as much as the fact that when plants respire, right? So plant root respiration produces CO2, right? Or actually produces carbonates, and those carbonates precipitate because there's not enough, we don't get enough rainfall and precipitation here to leach out carbonates. Okay, and carbonates essentially create fairly neutral to higher pH. So a lot of people think that our soils here are just because our substrates are calcium carbonate or something. They're not. The carbonates are coming from biology. So decomposition and plant respiration produces, or they're respiring CO2. That CO2 is dissolving in the soil solution, but then it precipitates because there's just not enough water to move those carbonates through the soil profile. So if you go out to our soils in like grasslands around here, and you try and react them with hydrochloric acid, you often see effervescence, and that's because the carbonates precipitate. And the depth of carbonates reflects how much precipitation you tend to get. So as you go to the east from here, the layer of that carbonate reaction gets deeper and deeper and deeper because there's more rainfall that's moving those carbonates lower into the soil profile. And then when you get out into forest, you don't find any of those because there's enough water to move them through. It happens on smaller scales here too, actually. If you go into, and we do this in my soils class, you can go from like a north-facing slope grassland to a south-facing to like a gully, and the layer of that carbonate goes deeper and deeper and deeper until you get to, in wetter sort of drainage systems, you can't find any evidence of carbonate. But, so that's largely, and our part of the geology essentially here, because it is sedimentary, tends to promote higher pH as opposed to like, but in granite systems around here, we have fairly low pH. But mostly soils, I would say 4 to 6. Once you get into soils below 4, you're in a pretty acidic soil. The one thing I haven't mentioned much, and I'm not going to, but we don't have time. But I mentioned isotopes as when we were talking about nitrogen fixation. Okay, so you can use nitrogen, the fact that nitrogen has a stable isotope to assess at some level how much plant nitrogen is coming from nitrogen fixation. This fact that nitrogen has this stable isotope is also very useful for tracing nitrogen use through ecosystems, okay? And that's because nitrogen, this molecule and this molecule are the same, except what's the one difference between this and this? What is the 14 versus 15?
Has an extra neutron.
Has an extra neutron, okay? And because it has an extra neutron, it's actually it's a huge molecule, right? But it is bigger. So, and organisms, when they're taking up nitrogen, discriminate against the bigger molecule. Okay, and so this is called fractionation. So there's lots of fractionation when nitrogen is being transformed. And what it tends to do is enrich systems in the big one, and they use and get rid of this one, right? So in highly N-rich systems, you tend to see much more N15 than N14. Okay, and it's not like they're looking at this one and they're saying, oh, you're bigger than me, or than that one, so I'm gonna take it up. It's just enzymes. The enzymes have an affinity for the lighter form of nitrate. I love watching people hold back the yawns. Don't hold them back, man.
All right. Don't mean to be rude.
No, you're not being rude. No offense taken. I'll yawn too. But this fact that nitrogen does, that processes in the nitrogen cycle discriminate against this means that you can use N15 as a tracer to figure out what sort of trace nitrogen use through ecosystems. So if we wanted to say, what's the fate of deposited nitrogen in ecosystems, you can use 15N labeling experiments and then trace those. And because this one is so much more abundant than this one, if you use this one as a tracer, it's really easy to see where nitrogen is going. But in something like ammonia volatilization or a nitrification or a denitrification, this one tends to get depleted and this one tends to get enriched. Okay? Because processes in the nitrogen cycle discriminate against the heavier form of nitrogen.
Sound like a bird.
Hold me up.
Yeah, this is just sort of highlighting this, right? It's ammonia volatilization is highly pH dependent. I think I covered that. But here's a picture of essentially areas where you get, or an image showing regions on the planet where you tend to see higher rates of ammonia volatilization. Right, and as you might expect, it's in systems where agriculture is predominant. It doesn't tend to be a big loss pathway in natural systems. And this is from essentially either systems where they're adding manure or organic forms of nitrogen. Okay, and that tends to be the most, if you think about, if you were going to add a nitrogen fertilizer, now that we know something about the nitrogen cycle, if you were going to add a form of nitrogen to try and fertilize plants and ecosystems, what would you add?
Anhydrous ammonium.
Why?
It's the most abundant and easiest to fix from atmospheric nitrogen.
Leach right away.
Okay, so it's abundant, but so is ammonium nitrate, or nitrogen can be produced in all
Yeah, it
different
doesn't
forms.
leach right away.
What did you say?
It doesn't leach.
Why doesn't it leach?
It needs to be converted because it's a cation, so it's not going to just leach out of the system. It needs to be reduced.
So the ammonia is not a cation, it's an organic form of nitrogen, right? So it has to be mineralized first, right? Before it gets into a form that could potentially be lost. And so by adding something that includes a rate limiting step before it can be lost, you actually increase the length of time that it stays in the system, right? Because microbes have to break it down first before it gets into a form that's going to be potentially lost. Whereas if you add nitrate, right, or ammonium nitrate, it's just a salt. It quickly dissolves, and then it's instantly, the potential for loss is instant, as opposed to something that has to be converted from an organic form to an inorganic form first. So that's the real reason that organic forms of nitrogen and compost, right? Why adding compost as a nitrogen source is better than adding a bag of fertilizer, because you have to, there's a microbial set of microbial processes that have to happen first before it can get lost from the system. I always ask in my soils class, so I can remember, you go to a Yankee swap, and your brother and your roommate comes home with a bag of fertilizer and a bag of compost, and which one do you add to which one's better to add to your garden? So if you're fertilizing just your home garden, why is it better to add compost than it is to add fertilizer? This is one reason. What are some of the other reasons?
I mean, it also has a lot of organic material in general.
Why is that good?
Well,
Minerals.
Yep.
it gives it a high cation exchange capacity.
Okay, so cation exchange capacity, water holding capacity, right? It's substrate for fungi and all these other organisms in soils, and this is part of the benefit, if you will, of organic forms of agriculture, is that you're adding all these other benefits to the soils as opposed to just adding fertilizer, right? Because there's substrates for organisms, you're adding organisms themselves. So there's, and unfortunately, we know more about sort of effective nutrient management than we actually practice. And largely, I think that isn't because we don't know, it's just because in some cases, it's just easier and it's cheaper to add a really cheap source of nitrogen fertilizer than it is to, go to some of the lengths that it requires to produce similar quantities of food, for example, using organic methods. There was a really great paper that was in, I can't remember, but this guy, David Pimentel, who was a Cornell researcher when I was a graduate student at Cornell, and he did this whole study on sort of comparing organic versus conventional agriculture from a nutrient and carbon biogeochemical perspective. And it's just amazing how much more sustainable organic agriculture is. And if you do it right, it produces the same amounts of yield. It's just much more costly to do it. But from a nitrogen perspective especially, it's way better. Okay, so this is the last step in the nitrogen cycle, denitrification. So again, if we think back to our kind of energy ladder, right, where organisms are doing processes basically to get energy, this one is a very highly energy producing process. And so if we are in a system and we reduce oxygen, this one is the next one that provides the most energy for organisms. So it's very common. So it doesn't yield as much energy as aerobic respiration, but it's it's a very close second. Okay, so we're taking organic carbon and nitrate as the electron acceptor, the process producing CO2 and N2 gas. Okay, so right back to a form of atmospheric nitrogen, closing the nitrogen cycle. This is essentially, because we're producing nitrate, often this is the main mechanism through which nitrogen is lost, either in natural systems, or in agricultural systems. And if we're converting most of this to N2, that has no climate impacts, but the reality is that much of this denitrification that's happening in agricultural systems is producing a greenhouse gas. And that's why there's interest in understanding and managing the nitrogen cycle from a climate perspective, because this is a very important and potent greenhouse gas. Okay, this is a wide range as opposed to some of these processes that are fairly restricted to very specific genera of bacteria. This is a wide range of bacteria that can do this, and I think I mentioned last time there's some evidence that fungi can actually do this now, so fungal denitrification. I'd say that's still unclear, but there's some evidence that can happen. And these are all genetically based processes, so the organisms that do this have genes that encode for enzymes that can do this process. And there's a bunch of different enzymes, or a bunch of different genes across phylogeny that can essentially facilitate denitrification by organisms. So it doesn't yield as much energy as aerobic respiration, but because it does yield nearly that much, when you get into systems that are anoxic, nitrate tends to get depleted very quickly, right? So nitrification kicks in. This is exactly what I said. I also want to make sure and to point out that this happens actually in all soils, right? So just because you have a well-aerated soil does not mean that there's no denitrification happening. And that's because aggregates create microenvironments where you'd see variation, for example, in oxygen, right? And even in highly, like if you think about a system that's where lots of respiration is happening, so like high rates of decomposition, that depletes oxygen, right? And so you can get pockets even in overall aerated systems. You can get pockets where decomposition has depleted oxygen, and so where you get denitrification. Okay, and you can see seems to be this trade-off, oxygen availability, right? As oxygen availability decreases, that's when you expect increases in denitrification to take place. And this happens too, like this would be an example of a soil that's saturated, and so the iron goes from iron 3, which is sort of orangish, to this bluish reduced form of iron. These are the areas where you'd expect high rates of denitrification, where there's anoxia, but roots and organisms creating pathways for oxygen diffusion. You can get areas that are overall anoxic, but then also pockets in here where you see aerobic processes taking place. So not surprisingly, if you think about the relationships and under what conditions would you expect to see high rates of denitrification, obviously in areas where you have lots of nitrogen, high rates of nitrogen mineralization, those are the areas where you would see predict an increase in denitrification as the supply of the substrates needed in denitrification increases. This also is very episodic, I would say. Denitrification isn't just a steady process. It tends to be very, very episodic large losses, and that largely has to do with water availability. So in agricultural ecosystems, you tend to see higher pulses of denitrification right after like a flooding event, or in the springtime when there's lots of water available in the system. The proportions of the end products of denitrification are largely, or again, this is not necessarily mechanistic, but empirical, this relationship between water-filled pore space and these different gases. So you tend to see when you're at more towards saturated conditions, more of the product of denitrification is N2. When you're in systems where you have more oxygen availability, you get increasing proportions of NO or NO2, or N2O, I should say. Make sense? And intuitively, I think it makes sense as well that there's more efficient production of N2 when you have, when nitrate, or I should say when there's not another supply of electron acceptors like oxygen in the system. So there's a more efficient conversion of this when oxygen is less available. So above 80%, oxygen becomes so limited that N2O is consumed by denitrification and N2 becomes the dominant product. And then again, this is the complete denitrification results in N2, but this is more of this sort of leaky pipe idea as well. So the leaky pipe concept applies both to nitrification and denitrification. So here's all the complexity of this and why I think it's like if you're thinking about biogeochemical processes across elements, this is the most interesting one because there's all these possible fates and all these different processes involved in it and all these genes needed to do these different processes. Okay, this just gives you a sense there's iron-driven denitrification, so there's iron involved in this by some organisms. And I don't even know much about some of these processes, but anaerobic, so Animox is, I think it's an archaeal process, but combining ammonium and nitrite to produce N2. Sulfur-driven nitrate reduction, so a bunch of different pathways in the cycle that make it really active, right? As opposed to something like, I'll talk about phosphorus in a second. Phosphorus is boring. There's nothing going on with phosphorus, or for that matter, for most elements, right? Biogeochemistry is mostly, in thinking about biologically driven biogeochemistry, nitrogen is where most of it is happening. Okay, so just to review, the inputs of N to ecosystems, and this shouldn't say soil, this should be ecosystems. N2 fixation, this is the big one. Nitrogen deposition becoming increasingly important. Some in parent material. Okay, so that's it, really. N2 fixation, either biological or abiotic. Okay, and then the main losses, denitrification. Oh, pyro denitrification, I haven't mentioned this, but when fires burn through ecosystems, it's a huge loss of nitrogen, and that's because oxidation of nitrogen and denitrification can happen abiotically as well. So you volatilize nitrogen when you burn biomass. Okay, and so some ecosystems around here, you tend to see increases in soil nitrogen availability after fires, especially low intensity fires. But the majority of nitrogen that's converted during fires is actually lost from the system.
What is it lost
As N2O or N2 or NO or one of these gaseous forms. You can also get movements like in ash, or if you have organic material that isn't fully combusted, you just move it as organic nitrogen. So like when you have, stump, like vegetation that's being deposited downwind of fires that's not fully consumed, that's where you would expect some, or maybe most of it, to still be organic again. But if you're in an area where you have really high intensity heat, most of that is denitrified into gaseous forms, with a very small proportion of it actually sticking around in soils to fuel regeneration and recovery. And you tend to see that in low intensity fires. They provide a pulse of nutrients. That's actually one of the benefits from a nutrient perspective of frequent low intensity fire, is that it continuously takes organic forms. Because if you have a big organic matter, organic horizon in soils or in forest soils, at night, most of that nitrogen is completely unavailable. So these low intensity fires convert that from organic forms back into mineral forms that can enhance productivity. Okay, ammonia volatilization. We've talked about leaching and denitrification. I would argue these are the big ones. Ammonia volatilization, not as important. And there's abiotic removal in deep soils. Okay, so there's some evidence that lots of nitrogen that we have presumed to be leaving systems from denitrification is actually just being stored on cation exchange sites in deep soils. But this is would be mostly an issue in sites that have highly developed soils. Our soils around here, we don't have deep soils around here. Okay, I just wanted to mention a couple of things. So nitrogen, some of the broader effects of nitrogen in ecosystems. Nitrogen availability affects species composition and diversity beyond effects on productivity. This was a really ongoing and long-term set of experiments at the Cedar Creek LTER site in Minnesota, where they've done decades of research looking at how nitrogen affects species diversity. And what you tend to find is in each of these would reflect kind of how the species have changed as a result of deposition. And what you tend to see is that nitrogen favors weedy species, and those weedy species that can take advantage of higher nitrogen inputs tend to crowd out kind of the more oligotrophic, or the species that do better under nutrient poor conditions. Just naturally, you tend to see higher species diversity in lower nutrient soils. But when you have a mix of species, you add nitrogen, you tend to find a couple of winners and lots of losers. And that seems to be the mechanism that drives changes in species diversity with high nitrogen. Okay, so we go from really interesting, lots of stuff happening, to really quite boring. Phosphorus. Okay, so there's no gaseous phase for phosphorus, so it doesn't move around. Okay, there is a gaseous phase of phosphorus, but it's a highly explosive gas that is very difficult to produce. It's not produced naturally. Phosphine gas is what it's used to make bombs. Okay, but because it doesn't have a phase, a lot of the issues with nitrogen and the effects on ecosystems have to do with the fact that it can get transported and moved around over great distances really rapidly. Okay, but phosphorus doesn't do that. Phosphorus moves around as phosphate. Okay, it can only be taken up as an inorganic molecule. At least that's the current understanding, so there isn't organic phosphorus uptake that I know of.
Inorganic meaning oxidized.
Sorry?
Inorganic meaning oxidized, or meaning of geologic origin. When you say inorganic, exactly what?
Inorganic meaning that it's not associated with an organic, like it's not built into an organic matter. So I mentioned the case in which nitrogen can actually be taken up in organic forms and used. Phosphorus is taken up in inorganic forms. This is the inorganic form of phosphorus, phosphate, an ion. This one is not driven by biology, hardly at all. Okay, that's an oversimplification because organisms take up phosphorus and it's released during decomposition, but this is not, especially microbially, this is not cycled microbially. Microbes mineralize it and microbes take it up, but there's no energy transformations and lots of different redox states that fuel all the really interesting processes. In nitrogen cycling, we just don't see those in the phosphorus cycle. And nitrogen is mobile in soil. We've talked about this multiple times. Even though phosphate is an ion and it's a -3 anion, it is not generally leached from ecosystems. Why not?
Doesn't it have a stronger binding capacity with the cation exchange sites or with the?
Yep, so in highly weathered soils especially, most of the phosphorus is actually sharing oxygen electrons with the clay minerals. Okay, so the silicates oxygen and the phosphates oxygen, they're actually being shared, right? And so they bond more tightly. This isn't just like a cation anion exchange that happens on the outer sphere of clay minerals, it's actually attached within the sphere of clay minerals. And so that's one reason. The other one is just that even in relatively pea-rich ecosystems, most of that phosphorus is not available to plants. So they're scavenging it constantly. Okay, when there's phosphate available, it's going to be used by organisms. Okay, so you find very rarely, you can measure concentrations of phosphate in soil solution, but they're always quite low. And that's because there's just much more demand than supply. Most of the phosphorus sitting in soils or in ecosystems is in forms that organisms just can't use. It's either hasn't been weathered yet, so it's part of a mineral, or it's sorbed to clay minerals in form, or it's in organic forms that haven't been broken down yet.
So if it's absorbed into soil, is it pretty much unavailable for plants at that point, or is there?
Yeah, so here's phosphate, right? And so phosphate, it develops what we call inner sphere complexes, and mostly that's in relation or in association with either iron or aluminum. So iron +3, phosphate -3, they stick together, iron phosphate, right? And that is not a soluble form of phosphorus, and so organisms have to do something to make it soluble, right? And most of the forms of phosphorus in ecosystems are just not soluble, so we can't take them up. That happens with aluminum, but these inner sphere complexes, as opposed to cation exchange, which is an outer sphere complex where it's just a hydrogen bond that's attracting cations to exchange sites, phosphorus is actually, some of these oxygens are actually being shared either with iron or with aluminum or on the surfaces of clay minerals.
So if you have a system that is rich in nitrogen and therefore acidic, so it's leached cations, so you have an excess of aluminum, does that mean that the phosphate is more tightly bound, so you have?
Great question. You should read the Bowman paper I sent yesterday, because this was the hypothesis. This is what we hypothesized was happening, is that as a result of acidification, we are mineralizing more iron and aluminum, and that iron and aluminum was bonding with phosphate, and so that the plants were actually growing less because they were more phosphorus poor, and that wasn't actually the case. We didn't see that their tissue concentrations of phosphorus didn't decline. And so it wasn't, you would predict that, and that was probably happening to some extent, but the real effect in that system of the acidification was the direct effects of solubilizing all that iron, and then the plants suffering a toxic effect from all the iron and aluminum they were taking up. But you're exactly right. If you decrease the pH, right, you would solubilize this stuff, and you would expect phosphate in solution to bond with iron. But again, we just didn't see evidence that that was a big factor there. Okay, so absorption, phosphorus sorption, even in the most phosphorus poor ecosystems, there tends to be quite a bit of phosphorus, but it's in these sorbed forms. Okay, and you sometimes refer to as occluded forms. So it's just either physical or chemical protection. So they're either in forms of chemical forms that plants can't get, or they're stuck inside of physical structures that plants can't get. I'm gonna skip one here. Okay, so where is phosphorus coming from? Phosphorus is actually less than 1/100th of 1% of minerals. So like if you look at the composition of rocks and you measured all the things that are in rocks, phosphorus is in really low concentrations. Okay? Again, less than 1/100th of 1%. Most of it, when it does exist, exists in one of three forms of, and the phosphorus containing mineral is called apatite. And it can have a fluorine, a chlorine, or a hydroxyl apatite form. But most of this phosphorus, like the phosphorus that we mine, right, and use to produce phosphorus fertilizer, is coming from sedimentary rock, okay, that was concentrated in areas biologically. Okay, so organisms in the ocean essentially scavenging phosphorus and then being deposited into these big sedimentary deposits that have been cycled through biology at least once. Okay, so like this phosphate mining in Florida would have just been an area in which you had large production by ocean organisms concentrating dilute pools of phosphorus into one area, and now we're taking advantage of that concentrated pool to mine phosphorus rock, and then essentially to turn this into fertilizer, it just gets dissolved with acids. So you take phosphorus rock, dissolve it with acids to produce, you know, concentrate phosphorus fertilizer.
There's a really cool podcast, if you can put it out, but there's a phosphate mine on a South Pacific tropical island, and it all accumulated there because of seabirds.
Exactly.
They would just crap on it, and over the time
For millennia, right?
Really high phosphate concentrations.
Well, in some places they still do harvest guano for fertilizer. But most of this would have been, as I talked about the biological pump, most of this would have been cyanobacteria or really productive inland seas where you just got high rates of productivity and then deposition of cyanobacteria and primary producers over time that made these really rich deposits. And most of the world's production of phosphorus is from these deposits, and these deposits are really, there's just a few of them around the world. So Florida has a big phosphate mining industry. Idaho, right? So the Simplot mines in southern Idaho or in central Idaho. Idaho is in the U.S. is one of the world's biggest producers of phosphorus. The other ones, China's a huge global producer of phosphorus, and the other ones are in the Middle East. So it's not hard to sort of extend. And phosphorus, people have been talking about phosphorus as, like, in terms of like the next, not an energy crisis, but a nutrient crisis. And the geopolitics of phosphorus. People have been discussing whether the geopolitics of phosphorus might become important because so much of the world's remaining supply of phosphorus is actually sitting in the Middle East. And people talk about, in this article, talks about peak phosphorus, just like you might talk about peak oil. And lots of people are arguing that we've passed peak phosphorus and that the world's reserves of phosphorus are declining to the extent that we may not be able to, find enough or get enough to enhance, to fuel the productivity needed to feed everyone. Yeah.
So why, if it's driven by a long-term biological process, these sedimentary caches of phosphorus,
Yeah.
why is it not more spread evenly across the globe? Why is there like these huge deposits in these areas?
That's a good question. It may be more distributed, it's just the ones we can find and mine. It could have things to do with like where inland seas were and shallow seas, and so where you got the conditions were right to fuel really rapid productivity and deposition in those areas, as opposed to thinking about the size of the oceans. And the reality is even now, the areas where productivity is happening is pretty limited, right? It's on coastal systems or shallow seas or things like that, but I don't know, you should check this out. The citation is up there, it's from 2009, I think. But they may talk about that in a little bit more detail. But it's just interesting to think about, like, it being a nutrient, I think being talked about in terms of a potential crisis. I'd never even really considered it until I reading this article just about, and what's happening now is that what we're doing essentially is taking concentrated pools of phosphorus and diluting them across the planet by fertilizing and moving them, right, from a really concentrated area onto systems, and now it's being deposited eventually in oceans in really dilute forms. But one of the things this article talks about is at what point will it become economical to start remining phosphorus that's been, essentially deposited in river mouths and things like that. Okay, just two more. So this is as complex as the phosphorus cycle gets, and I don't mean to imply that it's simple. I think in some ways it's actually more complex. The complexity I'm talking about is the biogeochemistry and sort of the transformations of it is not complex. Ecosystems get born, right, with their calcium in them, right, in primary minerals in very low concentrations. These things, in order for ecosystems to develop, have to get weathered. So this is just weathering of primary minerals in ecosystems liberates calcium, phosphate, P into a pool of phosphate, and this is the actively cycling form of phosphorus. Okay, and it takes a long time for this stuff to weather out of ecosystems. Okay, and so in early succession, there's some evidence too that even in temperate systems, that phosphorus can be limiting to ecosystems just because it doesn't weather very quickly. Okay, once it weathers into this phosphate pool, this can either be taken up by a plant, taken up by a microbe, and then it sort of cycles through this plant, soil, organic matter, microbial system. Phosphate is again, the organic form of phosphorus is liberated by an enzyme, phosphatase. It just cleaves this ester bond to phosphorus, makes it back into phosphate, and then that can be taken up again. The reality is that biology isn't the only thing competing for phosphate. As we've seen, minerals and soil can compete for it as well. And so once you weather P into this phosphate pool, there's biological and geochemical sinks for it. And this seems to be, over the long term, through ecosystem development, these pools win. Okay, and so much of the phosphorus that's weathered originally tends to end up in these forms, these occluded forms, or in association with iron or in association with aluminum, that aren't available to organisms. But all of the active cycling of phosphorus is happening as phosphate. And this is I wanted to introduce this, our understanding of phosphorus and the concept kind of governing how we look at it dates back to 1976. These guys, Walker and Sayers, essentially proposed that this is what phosphorus looks like over ecosystem development. That, again, at the start of ecosystem development, you have basically your whole supply of P. And then essentially as ecosystems develop, it's just a constant and chronic loss of phosphorus to the point where when you get into old systems, there's relatively little phosphorus remaining. And that over time, the forms of these things change, right? So you have organic P, this phosphorus Pi not included, that's just that's our measurable phosphate. That would tend to increase as you weather soils, but then over time, most of this phosphorus enters these occluded forms or unavailable forms. So that in the tropics, like where I work, most of the phosphorus is actually sitting either in organic forms or in forms like aluminum phosphate or iron phosphate or associated with minerals that plants just can't get. And so these are the P-limited ecosystems. These are sort of the ecosystems where you would expect phosphorus not to be as limiting to processes. Humans are having a big effect on the transport of phosphorus too, and so fires again transport or move around lots of phosphorus. It's not like a new form of phosphorus or a new supply. Most of phosphorus is just moving around. Okay, so it's like a redistribution of phosphorus. do you think? You into it? You guys look really into it. But that's all I'm gonna talk about nutrients. So if you have questions, now's your chance. I think everyone needs a fall break. All right. I'll give you a 5-minute fall break.